It is lovely to see you all here on such a gorgeous afternoon in Princeton. I always say about this time of year, Princeton is so beautiful, it's painful in the springtime. It's very beautiful, and it's so nice to have you here on this beautiful day. My name is Wallace Best, and I am Acting Director of the Center for African American Studies. And on behalf of the Center, I welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. Sponsored jointly by the Center for African American Studies and Princeton University Press, the Toni Morrison Lectures are held annually to spotlight the new and exciting work of scholars and writers who have risen to prominence both within the academy and in the broader world of arts and letters. The lectures result in a book to be published by Princeton University Press and celebrate the expansive literary imagination, intellectual adventurousness, and political insightfulness that characterize the writing of Toni Morrison. The series has already brought before us some of the best and brightest. Emeritus Professor Cornel West delivered the inaugural Toni Morrison Lectures entitled The Gifts of Black Folk in the Age of Terrorism in October 2006. Edwidge Dandicott, author of Brother, I'm Dying and many other novels, delivered the second annual lecture entitled Create Dangerously, the Immigrant Artist at Work. That was in March of 2008. And in October of 2009, the Honorable Cory Booker, Mayor of Newark, New Jersey, in case you don't know who Cory Booker is, presented The Unfinished Journey of America's Spirit. And then last April, Tony Award-winning choreographer Bill T. Jones delivered The Life of an Idea, investigating, belonging, appropriating, and adapting in the context of time. With tonight's speaker, the Toni Morrison Lectures series continues its tradition of bringing before us the best and the brightest. We're most honored to have Elizabeth Alexander, poet, essayist, playwright, and teacher, as this year's Morrison Lecturer. Elizabeth Alexander is the Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of African American Studies and Professor of American Studies and English at Yale University. An extraordinary poet of great renown, she has published numerous books of poems, poetry collections, and essays, including The Venus Hottentot, Body of Life, Antebellum Dream Book, American Sublime, and most recently, Crave Radiance, New and Selected Poems, 1990 to 2010, which won the 2010 Patterson Prize for Poetry. And we still delight in the memory of the historic moment in 2009 when she read Praise Song for the Day, a poem she composed and delivered for the first inaugural of President Barack Obama. The title of Professor Alexander's two-part lecture series is The Idea of Ancestry in Contemporary Black Art, and tonight's lecture is entitled A Voice from the Non-Dead Past, Rethinking Lucille Clifton. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Elizabeth Alexander.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I really can't imagine a higher honor. I want to thank Professors Best and Glaude for inviting me and for being so accommodating about my visit. Princeton African American Studies is both brother and sister to us at Yale African American Studies, so I come in the spirit of shared inquiry, generosity, and joint mission. With our colleagues elsewhere, I am so proud of the work that's being done in African American Studies writ large today, the creativity with which the field is evolving, the intensity of the research agenda, and the continuing understanding that the work we do is urgently motivated. I want to also thank Fred Appel and Princeton University Press for co-sponsoring this visit and for offering to make a book of these lectures in a much later form without having heard a word. I want to also thank Jennifer Losi, who arranged every detail of this visit with great care, and also to say how happy I am that my brother and sister-in-law, Mark and Tracy Alexander, are here today. So it's a very special treat to have family here tonight. In addition to being here in a community of friends and cherished interlocutors, I am here in the name of the magisterial Toni Morrison. It is no small thing to write lectures under the sign of Queen Morrison. Every word is under pressure. Every choice must be precise. I can only gesture toward the holistic grandeur of her vision, her consistent historical excellence, and her invention. But in addition to invoking her as the muse for these words, I also stand humbly in the shadow of the infinite what could be so present in her work, the integrity that never flags, and the profound love for Black people in all of our complexity that animates the work. In encountering and imagining Black people as infinitely fascinating and worthy of her sustained artistic attention, Morrison gives us a sterling example of how, while great art is great art, sometimes great art also ennobles a people. In this work, I humbly attempt to move in her spirit as I begin to think about, and these are beginning thoughts, so I'm very excited that there's a robust Q&A period, because I've put some things together to talk about with you. As I begin to think about contemporary Black creativity, as it emerges from long lines of innovative responses to the disproportionate death and violence that plague our communities. Quote, "Not a house in the country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief," Morrison wrote in Beloved, as you well know. And I'm interested in creative emergences from that ineluctable fact. One, a voice from the non-dead past, rethinking Lucille Clifton. The recent posthumous publication of the collected poems of Lucille Clifton and the acquisition of her archive by Emory University provide the opportunity to consider the work of this great American poet in its full dimension. Today, I will reframe her body of work away from what Morrison once again laments about the ways that Lucille Clifton has been thought about and written about. Morrison wrote in the introduction to the volume, and I should say that Morrison and Clifton have a very long relationship. They were students together at Howard University. Imagine Toni Morrison, Lucille Clifton, Amiri Baraka, many others, all at Howard at the same time, having very different experiences that they've written and talked about at various moments. And then when Morrison was at Random House, she edited Lucille Clifton and brought out her memoir, Good Woman. So it's a very long relationship, and she writes this introduction. Accolades from fellow poets and critics refer to her, Clifton's, universal human heart. They describe her as a fiercely caring female. I do not disagree with these judgments. Yet I am startled by the silence in those interpretations of her work. There are no references to her intellect, imagination, scholarship, or her risk-taking manipulation of language. To me, she is not the big mama, big sister of racial reassuring language. I read her skill as emanating from an astute, profound intellect. Clifton knew in life that she was underestimated. Let me read this poem. The title is in quotation marks. We do not know very much about Lucille's inner life. From the light of her inner life, a company of citizens watches Lucille as she trembles through the world. She is a tired woman, though well-meaning, they say. When will she learn to listen to us? Lucille, things are not what they seem. All is wonder and astonishment. And so in those last three lines, you could read the third line from the end as Lucille, pause, and that's how you want to read it, things are not as they seem, the patronizing voice that is telling Lucille Clifton that she doesn't very well understand the world. But of course, what it's also saying is Lucille, things are not what they seem. She is not how she appears to be. And then with the surprise repetition that you almost read as a typo, all is wonder and astonishment. The plenitude of that repeated all gives us the sense of the plenitude and sort of infinity that she knows is within the astonishment that she carries within her. I want to think a little bit today then about the philosophical underpinnings of poems that speak across the porous scrim between life and death that is a premised understanding of Clifton's work. I also want to spend some time with Bill T. Jones's work in the context of art that walks the line between life and death that is so clearly demarcated in the AIDS crisis, which of course has affected Black communities so disproportionately. And I like the idea that in putting Bill T. Jones's work next to Lucille Clifton's work, that it is in some ways an unlikely juxtaposition that I hope will seem inevitable when we're through with the evening. The overarching title of this lecture series, the idea, and of course, so It's hard enough to come up with titles. I think titles are very hard. And then to have a title for the whole series. I had to make 3 titles. And then I had to weave the overarching title into the 2 titles. So I want to talk about that title because it's good. The overarching title of this lecture series, The Idea of Ancestry in Contemporary Black Art, borrows, of course, from Etheridge Knight and his great poem, The Idea of Ancestry. I'll read a little bit. Taped to the wall of my cell are 47 pictures, 47 black faces, my mother, father, grandmother, one dead, grandfathers, both dead, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, first and second, nieces and nephews. They stare across the space at me sprawling on my bunk. I know their dark eyes, they know mine. I know their style, they know mine. I am all of them, they are all of me. They are farmers, I am a thief. I am me, they are thee. I have the same name as one grandfather, 3 cousins, 3 nephews, and 1 uncle. The uncle disappeared when he was 15, just took off and caught a freight, they say. He's discussed each year when the family has a reunion. He causes uneasiness in the clan. He is an empty space. My father's mother, who is 93 and who keeps the family Bible with everyone's birth dates and death dates in it, always mentions him. There is no place in her Bible for whereabouts unknown. He wrote this poem about the many years he spent in prison, not dead, but a virtual death form of community and family, yet fully in family, as represented in the poem by the pictures on the wall. The black family takes place across prison walls, in and out of neighborhoods. It takes place across time. It is represented in the poem and in our lives by the photographs we dog-ear and hold up against the ravages of time and circumscribed opportunity. The black family takes place across the erasure of the Middle Passage. And finally, the black family takes place across the line between life and death. The dead in Knight's gallery sit alongside the living. The dead, as well as the living, quote, stare across the dark space at me sprawling on my bunk. The dead witness, the dead are as present as the living, which is also to say, and here we come to the idea of ancestry, not present. You no doubt noticed the long breath of Knight's lines in the excerpts I read for you. The poet and critic Edward Hirsch describes the impact of the long line in poetry in English with quite eloquent precision. He says, blank verse offers the normative line in English poetry, the line closer to actual speech, as both Wordsworth and Frost perceived, and so one tends to feel that lines extending well beyond 5 beats and 10 syllables are also going beyond the parameters of oral utterance, or over them, beyond speech itself. The long lines widen the space for reverie. They have a dreamlike associativeness, as in the early poems of W.B. Yeats. Or else they radiate an oracular feeling of prophetic utterance. This feeling of prophetic utterance is in full flower in Knight's great poem. His long lines race forward with river force and speed. Taped to the wall of my cell are 47 pictures. He uses commas where grammatical logic calls for periods, again animating the swift movement from, quote, the brown hills and red gullies of Mississippi back to grandmother's backyard to Memphis, and then to a bunk in a cell in an Indiana prison where the speaker meditates on his place and legacy. That swift poetic movement also illustrates the seamless slippage between life and death and the palpable present of ancestors in the present, even as they are an idea, a proposition, the broken line willed straight and the circle unbroken. That long line in American poetry that we see in Knight is obviously the bequest of Walt Whitman, and it also illustrates something about American space and spaciousness, I think, of its huge geographical divides and the spans of the Great Migration, reaching across tremendous distance and marking the space between where the life of families take place. The long line is also a spoken line, an orated line, a church line, and it rolls and unfolds in the manner of the black preachers whose grandiloquent speaking style has left such a strong imprint on the culture. What is it to be of a family is the enormous question Knight asks in the end. I know their dark eyes, they know mine. I know their style, they know mine. I am all of them, they are all of me. They are farmers, I am a thief, I am me, they are thee. The jazzy back and forth captures how a person navigates the waters of genealogy, how one is and is not of the tribe, the community, singularly oneself, simultaneously part of the larger whole. That rhetorical pattern is repeated at the end of the poem to great effect. I pace my cell or flop on my bunk and stare at the 47 black faces across the space. I am all of them, they are all of me, I am me, they are thee, he repeats, and then with a turn, and I have no children to float in the space between. And interestingly, in different published versions of the poem, he changed back and forth. He never settled children to sons to children to sons. Night marks an existential interspace in this rightfully legendary poem, helping us think about the space between bars from which a prisoner speaks, the space in African American historical and family memory that have been erased by the Middle Passage, the Middle Passage itself so starkly a literal space between, the space between one station of life and another, soldier and civilian, overseas and then back home, class distances within families, in and out of prison, between North and South, country and industry, ancestry, a process, not mere inheritance. So the idea of ancestry is a leitmotif that moves throughout these lectures, moving towards a new thought about ancestry in which the dead are unremarkably present in the day-to-day of Black life. That concept is not new. I'm just taking note of it here and thinking about these creative texts. All the Black people know that, it is not, I'm not coming with news when I say Black people live with our ancestors in a very matter-of-fact way, but I'm trying to think about how that might play out with this literature. Let's return to Clifton, who expresses the prophetic in short, deft lines. Lucille, light, illuminata. Though Lucille is gone, her body is gone from this earth, she is not gone. And the invitation to write this lecture more or less coincided with the publication of her collected poems, which was edited beautifully by Kevin Young and Michael Glazer. The book opens with and it's a huge, big doorstop of a book, which is, I think, an important thing when you think about Clifton's work, which is known for its literal smallness, small poems. She doesn't always write with exclusively lowercase letters, but comes to do that. And Kevin Young recently spoke, it was very, very interesting, about the decision, about how some editors have made the decision to do things like regularize. She meant to eventually get to this way of writing everything lowercase, but of course he's left, because it's important to see that she made a journey to these small, beautiful poems, and her books are small and exquisite and essential. So seeing this big, huge doorstop of a book is certainly physically remarkable. And the book opens with a section of her poems from beginning in 1965 that have not been collected in book form, and then the editors generously weave the unpublished poems throughout the book so that you have everything eventually in its proper order. Those poems, those first ones, were placed in a folder called First Poems, and then also she had a series of folders we learned in the introduction called Bad Poems, which Young cleverly reads as bad poems, i.e. in the Negro vernacular, super bad poems, because in fact they are. And her vernacular is very, very easy in her poems. As well. We can see then the full complement of the work, the wingspan of the body of work, its magnitude, her ongoing concerns, her deepening understandings, and her always recognizable voice, clear and swift as a stream. The phrase, "nothing human is alien to me," is ascribed to Terence and Cicero, reprised by Robert Hayden in the Peacock Room. Nothing human is alien to the poet Lucille Clifton. In her poems, we learn that to be human fundamentally is to suffer. To be human is to survive. To be human is to harm others. To be human is to testify. To be human is to exalt power. To be human is to notice small things and name them. I think of a poem like Study the Masters, its extraordinary pith. And here we have a bit of that. Study the Masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron, or one like hers, that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too, words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. Study the masters. And so I think where we, quite masterfully see her understanding of history, see certain kinds of intellectual philosophizing, see a sense of identification with ancestors, with black female ancestors at different distances, and also see a very, very succinct and profound critique and it continues, she talks about how this noticing tells you so much about America. The body of her work is similarly paired, clean, influenced, yes, by the elemental odes of Neruda to characterize it, also by Emily Dickinson and William Blake. She used it to name just a few, and I'm trying again to make some maybe unexpected contexts. There are many others to say as well. There's a whole lot of intertextual work with other African American poets that's going on. Her conversation with Gwendolyn Brooks is really fascinating across the work, so that's for another time. She uses a relatively small vocabulary in the work, which is to say, she returns to words that are for her elemental and turns them over and over again to the light. So there's all of this, to use a familiar phrase, repetition with a difference, but even more, understanding a certain kind of physical quality, material quality of the words and working them through and through. Words such as light, fingers, fox, woman, mama, and mad. And most of the poems have questions in them, real questions, frequently unanswerable questions, existential questions, questions of a lifetime that are not necessarily answerable. In the very earliest work, in 1965, work that has not been collected in book form before this book, we see the directness of her voice and the keen understanding of the relationship of mother wit to philosophy that runs throughout the work. How her poems understood gesture and pith, and that's one thing that I think will resonate a little bit more with the Bill T. Jones. Each poem a perfect thing. Illuminate I can, and so illuminate I did, she wrote in a poem where she assumed the persona of Lucifer. She did that in several poems. She was very interested in her own name and its etymology, and then connected that to speaking in the voice of Lucifer and thinking about the concept of illumination when you have the birthright of the name Lucille. But I'm particularly interested in how, from the very start, we see a matter-of-fact assertion that between the living and the dead, there are open channels of communication. This is the poem, the first one in the book, Black Women. America made us heroines, not wives. We learned the tricks to keep the race together, but had to leave our men to find themselves, and now they damn what they cannot forgive. Even old Massa's son lives in a dream, remembering the lie we made him love. America made us heroines, not wives. We hid our ladiness to save our lives. The poem, in its final couplet, uses a bit more conspicuous rhyme than we usually see in Clifton. In that little conclusion, we hid our ladiness to save our lives. And I think that the rhyme and almost nursery rhyme quality of the rhythmic structure in that couplet belies the incredible toughness of the assessment in that line and the historical understanding that's in that line. I think that in that short poem, there could be no better or more concise essay on what feminist theory calls intersectionality and competing identities than this. We had to leave our men to find themselves, and now they damn what they cannot forgive. Clifton understands the stakes as well of surviving in black women's bodies. So interestingly, the poem is refigured shortly after, just a few poems later in those first ungathered poems, in a poem called Conversation Overheard in a Graveyard. The poem is cast as a conversation between Sojourner and Harriet, who speak directly to the poet as she presumably visits them in a graveyard. Of course, these two particular historical figures do not share a final resting place. So Clifton is creating a virtual graveyard where a present-day black woman can speak and be spoken to her ancestors. Conversation overheard in a graveyard. This place, Conversation Overheard in a Graveyard. Harriet, it's written like a play. Harriet, this place has made us heroines, not wives. and kept us from its sparkles and its paints, and made us dull in natural disguise. Sojourner, we've lost our ladyhood, but saved our lives. Harriet, what mirror will remember you and me, suckling strangers and sons? Sojourner, history. The 1980 book, Two-Headed Woman, is sort of a really interesting coming out book for her, a coming out into seerdom, into second-sightedness, into a continual notation of the extraordinary of the ordinary. Her word ordinary, as it moves all the way throughout her work, is usually coded along with disappointment earlier in the work, but then as she moves into Two-Headed Woman and forward, ordinary comes to attain something that is actually rather extraordinary. The quotidian is full of insight and possibility. And in these poems, we see the fuller flowering of some of her work that came about through spirit writing. Now, what do I mean by spirit writing? Lucille Clifton, and this archive is pretty newly, it was acquired at Emory shortly before she passed away, and so there hasn't been a lot of, I haven't physically been there yet, I just am continually bugging Kevin Young to say, so then what was in that box, and tell me, but it hasn't been used much, and for those of you who are interested, it's time to go. Clifton worked with a Ouija board. And in her archive at Emory are cubic feet of boxes of this spirit writing. I said, what does it look like? And he said, well, it's not always English, he said, but it always makes sense. Even when it is not a discernible language, there is a graphic logic to it. So she would consult a Ouija board and then would write down the messages she received from the spirit world directly, and then transcribe them and craft them into poems. In later books, she calls them messages, and she sometimes says they come from the messengers, but sometimes, quite matter-of-factly, they simply are. The porous scrim between life and death, with poems that we might group as the historical ones, speaking in explicitly historical personae, she freely inhabits and conjures the sojourners of the past, and then will turn to write in her named body, Lucille's body, a black woman's body, a body with hips, eventually a one-breasted body, a body anatomized, a body ravaged by cancer and kidney disease, a body that issued forth 6 children, a body that does sing the blues. So she's always known a great deal about death in her day-to-day life, about dying, fragile bodies marked by disease, family abuse, early death, and austere poverty. And so as such, she is a poet of woe, but a poet who I would say turns in woe to ancestral understanding in ways that are quite amazing. I'll read to you here The Death of Fred Clifton. Lucille Clifton's husband, who was a philosopher himself, Fred Clifton, died at the age of 49 in 1984. I seem to be drawn to the center of myself, leaving the edges of me in the hands of my wife. And I saw with the most amazing clarity, so that I had not eyes but sight. And rising and turning through my skin, there was all around not the shapes of things, but oh, at last, the things themselves. She describes death as her husband describes death to her from the other side. The poems are all explicitly in small, lowercase letters by now, but the unmistakable lift of the O in that poem, but oh, at last, the things itself, and she frequently uses that O, marks the turn to revelation in the poem. Intimate as a mother's whispered voice at bedtime, oh, that lifts the poem into prophetic knowledge. After Clifton died, I wrote a poem that I felt she gave me, a poem that came on the winds of poems of hers that I knew, a poem that it truly felt she breathed into me from the other side. 1 week later in the strange. 1 week later in the strange exhilaration after Lucille's death. Our eyes were bright as we received instructions lined up with all we were supposed to do. Now seers, now grace notes, now anchors, now tellers, now keepers and spreaders, now wide open arms. The cold wind of generational shift blew all around us, stinging our cheeks, awakening us to the open space now everywhere surrounding. Lucille's poems do not reassure exactly. They don't mean to, never did, but they offer the real true knowledge that every shut-eye ain't asleep and every goodbye ain't gone. And that is the continuation, the responsibility, the way that art endures and stands after we do, in line with itself, a line longer than any traceable blood family, begetting and begetting. Part 2, Not Dead, Not Dead. This section title comes from Du Bois of The Passing of the Firstborn, not dead, but escaped, not bond, but free. It too sees continuity between those of us who continue to walk this earth, a repeated insistence that dead is not dead, but rather, in this case, a freedom from the bonds of the veil that messages the brethren and sistren left behind. The art of the AIDS crisis had to contend with defining communities as its talented youth were suddenly taken away in its early days, and the art of that period, as you know, has a particular urgency that I've been thinking about as a long time, beginning as a young person watching it happen all around me in creative Black communities. I want to look back now for a minute to one dance in particular of Bill T. Jones in the present-day context of this meditation to think about art that marks the proximity of death to the living. I won't rehearse the details of Jones's extraordinary career for you tonight. I know he was here last year for these very lectures, but I'll call to attention a few influences that I think are noteworthy and perhaps less immediately visible in the avant-garde context in which he's usually discussed. I've done 2 very long interviews with him about his work and influences, and he's spoken about the southern context of Florida migrant growing up in a Florida migrant Black family who grew up picking potatoes, doing the dances and playing the hand games particular to that rhythm, listening to the blues of B.B. King and others, songs that were entertainment but also Negro work songs. The work comes out of the exposure to the musical repertoire of ballet and modern dance, yes, and also out of the Black vernacular dance forms of Black folk in city and country. You see a tremendous amount of vernacular quotation in his work, actually, if you keep your eyes open for it. He is coevally influenced, he says, by the poet Derek Walcott, the architect David Ajay, the director Steve McQueen, the painters Kara Walker and Glenn Ligon, and for our purposes today, the sculptor Martin Puryear. And let me just take you through a few Bill T. Jones images. I'm going to do this very quickly. I want you just to sort of see everything, but see shapes too, and gesture, and the kind of essentialness that I think is actually a really interesting companion to Clifton's poems. Okay, and then we'll stay with Puryear for a moment. Though the AIDS crisis provides impetus and subject matter for much of Jones's work, he forms essential and enduring questions with wide-ranging relevance. As Gwendolyn Brooks reminds us, we are all infirm, and in Jones's work, mortality twinned with fierce living is the common denominator of the polis. Regarding his dance Still Here, Jones wrote, "The resources necessary to cope with life-threatening illnesses are the same as those necessary for truly owning one's life." I don't think I fully understand that dichotomy in the 1980s when the epidemic was the urgency everywhere and it seemed that we were always waiting for the other shoe to drop. HIV positive means something different now than it did in the 80s or even in 1993 when Jones made Still Here. Jones's Still Here dancing body testifies to endurance, work, self-care, scientific progress, perhaps genetic, sheer good fortune, so much we do not know. His creative process works toward the truest questions and then builds a movement vocabulary from the kinetic exploration of those questions. Rather than ask, as he does in Still Here, do you believe in God? His question is, what does your God look like? Now there is a question. He understands physical gesture profoundly, turning quotidian gestures into things danced, repeatable, and iconic. He continually returns to community, its struggle and best hope, and Still Here also shows us many moments where communities form and fray. A woman who has just received an HIV-positive diagnosis surrenders to the arms of friends, then wrenches away. A man whose mother has just died of cancer argues bitterly with an aunt, flat hands turned palm side out to deflect her words, protecting the vulnerable throat. Knots of bodies fall together, then fling apart. But Jones continues to arrange dancers in circles and move bodies in relationship to one another. The movements of his soloists are beautiful and rich, but most interesting and persistent is when and how he brings those individuals imperfectly, infirmly together. So the work exemplifies a kind of unsentimental communal values. The body grows weary, someone is flagging, the group steps in and falls away in constant recombination. Jones was always a gorgeous dancer, but he was never a supersonic dancer. The whisper of stiffness in his body's movement articulates the aspect of dance and living that is strive, sweat, aspiration, and hope. Dance beauty need not be solely supersonic. And I think that's an extraordinary thing that we see in his work. Now we're going to test my technology here. I want to show you, a dab of D-Man in the Waters. It's working. And so the things I want you to watch as you're looking at this, should I turn up a little bit? Oh, okay. As you're looking at this, is I want you to look at how groups assemble and immediately fall apart and come together again. I want you to look at shapes and gesture and look for moments of vernacular quotation. And I want you to think about the idea of crossing that so much defines this work. These attempts to cross and get to the other side. You see there those Miss Mary Mack hands, right, that are very familiar. So just enjoy while I talk. This work exemplifies in many ways what we mean when we say postmodern dance. It's a ballet set to classical music, but it's also not a ballet. It's in the modern dance idiom, not belonging to any one particular school, and breaking with certain conventions of ballet. There are partners, but partners are not always boy-girl. Certain tropes of masculinity and femininity are deconstructed so that, for example, carrying is not always designed to make the femme look graceful and elegant, nor does it hierarchize larger bodies as masculine and smaller bodies as feminine. Bodies can do more than their social roles might suggest. As I've said, vernacular movement wakes its way into this dance. Jog, stroll, Miss Mary Mack, the wave. Jones brilliantly understands gesture, so he sees the clean, clear shape in each of these illusions. The movement motif of swimming knits the work together. Sometimes, and there we go, right on cue. Sometimes completed, sometimes not. The swimming conjures the phrase, just trying to keep my head above water, a crossing, a surviving, when rendered playfully. But the constant swimming is also a swimming, I believe, to the proverbial other side. The other shore, from this life to the next, the constant specter in the age of AIDS in years when people were here one moment, gone the next, when people had already been buried when a community was decimated, and when Arnie Zane had long since died in Jones's arms. In this swimming, the dancers move the sheer force and play of the dive and the breast and side stroke. But they don't get far because they can't get far. They can't get far on their own. They cannot make it across the stage, cross the water, cross over to the other side without the community to catch, to hold, to carry. This is a dance that was made about a dancer called Damien Aquavella, D-Man, and he at first performed the central role, and then as he became ill and was rapidly declining with AIDS, in the 1988-1989 season of Bill T. Jones' Arnie Zane, when he was too ill to dance, Jones would carry him on stage throughout the dance to be a part of the ensemble. Community is dissoluble, community holds. And the body is always perfect, even in its frailty. The body is perfect. So we're going to come out of this for a minute. And we're going to go back to this. How come it won't go back? That? Oh, double click it. Thank you. All right. And then make it like this, right? I'll just go quick, thanks. Okay, so to Martin Puryear, very quickly. I want you to just think about the relationship of these sculptures by Martin Puryear to Jones's work and to Clifton's work. You seem to see the same sense of velocity of line, of cleanliness, of air and light, the same concern with elemental shapes, the purity of gesture, the beauty of the quotidian, be it material, in organic shapes like the circle, in which we see in Puryear and also in gesture in Jones, repeated here. And he's also always working with organic materials, Puryear. But also, when arms join round to make a circle, Jones is always playing with convening and scattering the human circle, but when arms join round in an attempt to hold something, to grasp, that grasping, that holding is evanescent. It never quite gets all the way there. When you make that encircling gesture properly in modern dance vocabulary, the center of the body contracts. The movement is experienced by the dancer simultaneously as embrace and gut punch, referring to the visceral and the viscera. It's at the very center of self, of relationships, and of community. I think in these images of Puryear's, the song Will the Circle Be Unbroken, a song that wonders many things, and also how we continue to stay connected to our loved ones in the by and by, a continued question about how we aspire to encircle and to hold as we move from one life to the next. So, coming toward conclusion, is this now the second clip? Yes, perfect. This is how the dance ends. The D-man figure, a brilliant shooting star who dies at 32, who is held in his community's arms, a community that helps him swim across the waters into the next life in this dance, a community that holds him aloft when he cannot lift himself, a community that shares its body when his weakens, is shown to us in the final moments of pure exaltation in this dance. A new circle has been formed, standing, all dancers present, not just a cluster of a few, full force and fully embodied. D-Man will be centered in the circle as it forms. He's lifted high and then tossed up in pure exuberance. So I want you to watch. A 16-year-old wrote that music. By the end of the piece, the community is wild with joy and pure exuberance as in the dancing. But I want you to note that moment. The lights go black, and when it's done properly, and it's very hard to time properly, we see him flying in full ascent at the apex of his flight, and then the blackness, the blackout, means we never see him come down or start to come down. We can then read the ending as he has been flung heavenward by his community, and in that blackened moment, his body is gone. But the whoops and yells audibly of the community remain. Who will be here next week, next year? In that black moment that is a part of the dance after the stage lights have fallen, we do not know who we will see when the lights come up. Theater is magic. The D-man dancer comes back and is healthy for the curtain call. But we have been taken to the precipice, a place where exaltation is utterly proximate to desolation. What choice do we, the living, have when the ones we love die, but to keep on walking, and hopefully keep walking in community? In her poems that walk the lines between life and death, Lucille Clifton found prophetic truth. In those poems, she explored the birthright of her name, Lucille, and found a way to keep walking as loved ones died, as children were lost in various ways to cancer and to mental illness and its evil twin, drug abuse. And so perhaps the greatest of these poems, to return to Clifton, The Light That Came to Lucille Clifton, is a poem where the death of her husband occasions a deeper understanding about living. Death can begin us anew, woefully but necessarily. Death is not a gift, but it is a given. You will note Clifton's use of the resigned phrase, "you might as well," in this poem. And in that decimation is a question and an invitation to move towards a deeper knowing. The light that came to Lucille Clifton. The light that came to Lucille Clifton came in a shift of knowing, when even her fondest sureties faded away. It was the summer she understood that she had not understood and was not mistress even of her own off eye. Then the man escaped, throwing away his tie, and the children grew legs and started walking, and she could see the peril of an unexamined life. She closed her eyes, afraid to look for her authenticity. But the light insists on itself in the world. A voice from the non-dead past started talking. She closed her ears and it spelled out in her hand. You might as well answer the door, my child. The truth is furiously knocking. From the non-dead past, the poem shows us how to live. Thank you. Technology worked.
It worked.
Yes. Questions?
So,
Yes,
yes,
of course,
so-
yes.
Professor Alexander has graciously agreed to some Q&A. So, questions?
Lucille does do that to people. She renders things a bit meditative. Daphne,
Thank
you're welcome.
you. So we spent the morning, my graduate students, talking about Nat Mackey and wounded kinship and the ontology of loss and phantom limbs and so this is a beautiful extension of and reimagining of that conversation. And I guess I would love to hear you talk more about two things, both what poetry does in the way of formalistically responding to the ontology of loss. Any way you want to talk about that? Because of, this whole idea of the poetic line was so beautiful, the way you were mapping it out. So formalistically, I'm interested in that. And then, what would it mean to be able to read poetry as dance, which is very much embedded in this talk that you've gifted to us too? Just what do we do choreographically with poetry?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll start backwards because I think that that would entail, and there's just so much of this Lucille stuff, and what I've tried to do is really, you have to start yourself from scratch with her, because the poems are talismans, they are wise poems, she is a wise woman, she has guided us in many ways, so there are many poems that I've had memorized, that I've carried within me, that I want to see differently. And so looking across the work, the ways that she constantly narrates her body, I think would be a very important thing to look at. There's a way that she's very plainly descriptive about the body she comes in. Famously, we know the poem Homage to My Hips. But there are other ones where I think what's interesting is how she chronicles the ravages of illness on her body in a way that still maintains a kind of wholeness. She's not talking about phantom limbs exactly. She's talking about a wholeness in brokenness, but not cheerfully. And if anything, in narrating the story of her body, the phantom limb is, frankly, her father's fingers. Her father's fingers come up over and again in the work. He sexually abused her when she was a child. And so, again, with some of those very simple, repeated words, the way she uses the word terrible, the way she uses the word terrible to talk about, the way she uses the word mad, where she says, at least, I'm paraphrasing it, at least it was my father's fingers, not his thing. And oh, how mad I am. So in that Cliftonian duality, right, is like, this is what it's done to me. So I think that would be one really important thing to think through, and if things hold along with the Jones, I think, thinking about the changes of the body, and also that even outside of the AIDS context, the way that he was always quite clear that his postmodern dance had room for different kinds of bodies. So, his dancer, Lawrence Goldhuber, for example, is a big man, and a beautiful dancer. So for him, the question is always, well, can you dance? And what does that look like? His many dances that include regular people, One time long ago when I was living in Chicago and being a professor and having fantasies about lost lives, he did a big open call for dancers to be in, I think in Still Here. And I went to the big open call and I didn't get in and I was all sad, but then I went to see it and they were all naked. So it was like, that was all right. I'm not with Bill quite on that. And they didn't all look like Bill either. Were I to recap those slides and take us back to some pictures of Bill. But so at any rate, I think there's a whole thing to say about his ethics of the changing body that would dovetail really nicely with Lucille. I think also one would have to say more, and this gets to the first part of your question, about, and this was why, setting up the night not only for the idea of ancestry, but also to think about prophecy in the long line, and do we throw that on its head when we think about prophecy in the very, very, very short, swift lines, in the palm-sized poems, in the poems that also, you heard reference actually to the palms. It's spelled out in my palm. So that's also the messages, the Ouija board and all of that. But this idea, she said, I have 6 stair-step children. I write short poems. Because, that's my life, right? That's how it goes. And so she said, poems are written online. Poor people stand online. I stand online. I write poems that I can memorize. Poems are written at the kitchen table where somebody's got the measles and someone else is throwing up. That's when I write poems, because those were the material conditions of her life for a long time with all those kids. And I think that the way, again, I think the connection to Blake and Dickinson is very important as a way of understanding, well, there's also something that's not materially based about thinking about prayer books, hand-sized, koans, that sort of thing. But I think in looking at smaller forms, aphorisms, would be a way of thinking about size in the poems. Thank you. Tracy.
I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your sense of Clifton's sense of her own poetic mission. You spoke a little bit in the beginning about this, some of the private corrections that her poems are quietly making to ways that she has been misunderstood or the scale of her work has been diminished. But then there are also the poems that Letter to My Sons, I think.
I wish
so
them.
There are poems that are messages to people.
Yes.
There are poems that I almost never hear people talk about, but that I feel have a really strong sense of the environment. The earth
Yes.
thing, and,
Yes.
Then the poems that you spoke about that are messages from the others, the messengers that are the sense of the human. And then the very last poems in that beautiful collection that are almost about preparing yourself to stand and face death.
Yes.
I'd love to just hear how you trace those different projects.
Well, yeah, you really kind of laid out, there are so many different modalities that she works in, and I think what I would add to some of your categories is real historian poems. And some of them actually occasioned by history. So, for example, the poem, they ask me to remember what they want me to remember. And that's not what the story I want to tell, because that was when she was, she, as you know, lived in Maryland for many years and was probably the poet laureate of Maryland, and was asked on a historical commemorative occasion to write a poem to the history of the state of Maryland. And Lucille Clifton can't stand where Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, she can't write a cheerleading poem. And they said, well, why are you such a downer? But her historical insistence is, we will tell this story, but, she distills so much historical knowledge and understanding. And I think that's what Morrison, when she talks about the intellect, the actual, the book learning part of it, that's a really, really important mode as well. So those last poems, there wasn't time for everything, but I was really interested in those last poems because of the way that they are kind of a winnowing. I like the way you said as she prepares to face death, and I just want to find one because I put them together here. And it's kind of an extraordinary winding down of the book and a winding down So first she has, here we go, a poem that sort of takes stock of the body, which is getting ready to fail. I'm just going to mention it, sketch it. Some points along some of the meridians: heart, spirit path, spirit gate, blue-green spirit, little rushing in, utmost source, little storehouse. And then goes lung, stomach, liver, kidney, large intestine, spleen, and then gates. And then she moves on to a poem about New Orleans. When the body floated by me on the river, it was a baby body, thin and brown. It was not my Alexandra, my Noah, not even my river, but it was a dream. But when I woke, I knew somewhere there is a space in a grandmother's sleep, if she can sleep, if she is alive. And I want her to know that the baby is not abandoned, is in grandmother's hearts, and we will remember forever. And then an American story, almost her penultimate poem, which what I kind of love about it is we'd have to talk about humor in her work as well. Like there's one poem, Thing is another of her repeated ones in admonitions. Daughters, when a man shows you his thing like it's a good thing, you can laugh, And so in an American story, and remember, she's days away from death here. One year, a naked white guy parked his car by our elementary school. Kids called him the nude dude and laughed when they told the story. I didn't believe it because I was on the honor roll. Until the afternoon, he hopped at me all pink and sweaty and asked me, "Little girl, have you ever seen a white man's pride?" And I replied, "Oh yes, sir, many times, many times." Then the next poem, God Bless America. You don't know the half of it, like the old folks used to say. But the half of it is what I do know. What I don't know is the other. And then the last poem, in the middle of the I, not knowing whether to call it devil or God, I asked how to be brave, and the thunder answered, stand, accept. So I stood and withstood the fiery sight. And then a few days later, she passes. I'm just kind of adding on to the categories. Another category that I think is really important is intertextual poems, poems in which she is in active conversation with other writers. I think those are really, really interesting. And again, it's not about kind of, proving her graduate school literariness. But on the other hand, this is a poet who wrote over the course of 50 or more very, very interesting years in American poetry. And that she is writing in that time and also out of that time, and is very conscious about what it means to be to be an African American poet, to be an American poet, and to be a poet. She thinks about those things and meditates on those things a lot. And I think there's a great deal that's there. Yeah, thank you. Imani.
So thank you.
You're
for
welcome.
This, beautiful talk, and I find myself really affected by the way that you talked about Black family taking place across walls, across time, and it occurred to me that part of what resonated for me with it is sort of a different way of narrating or of talking about the journeys, right? So that as opposed to sort of a pathway map, the way we talk about the Afro-Atlantic, a pathway marking where we've been, it's actually an interior posture, right? That about family taking place across these spaces, and it has a kind of immediacy that I think. I mean, I got the sense from when you were talking, it requires a kind of incantation or an incantatory mode, right? And so what I'm thinking about, or want to sort of hear you talk about, is, what is that incantation? It's present in this work, and it's present throughout African American letters. That sort of incantatory mode. I mean, I'm thinking about it as having some resistance to the dominance of narrativity, and then perhaps maybe even these forms that you're working with, very poetic and poetry and dance, actually perhaps is part of what lends itself to talking about that. But I'm taken with that notion of the immediacy of the calling, making present of these paths that have brought us, taken us in different directions, but we're still sort of in a present with, whether it's with the past or with, a different locale.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of the kind of calling of the ancestors that we do in some contexts. That kind of call the roll, say the names, call the names out. The importance of saying those names because of what we are mitigating against, right? What does it mean when you don't necessarily have, I love in the line in the family Bible that the grandmother keeps, there is no space for whereabouts unknown, right? Though there is a family Bible, but that's all there is, that's paper to hold on to. So I think that we know how prevalent that understanding of, talk about the phantom limb, the lost record, the destroyed record, the never had record, the invented archive, all of these things that we talk about so much in our work, I think make what I would even sometimes call a mania for repetition and for calling the names and for litany, because that's how you hold it fast. And I think then when you fold into that the vagaries of our contemporary lives and the challenges of our contemporary lives, which leave no family untouched, no uninterrupted line, I think that makes it feel even more urgent, right? To stay the course, call the names, and perform that repetition over and over again. It's so much feels to be at stake, Yeah. Yes.
I'm thinking about what it means to invoke Lucifer, and I'm thinking in two ways. I'd be interested in hearing you talk about for her what it means to think of the etymology of her name, but also in relation to your theme of ancestry, and then more broadly, sort of where you see Lucifer in African American arts and letters.
Ooh, that's too big. Let's see. But I'm going to think about it. It is at the limits of my knowledge, is what I mean. Lucifer in African American.
Is her Lucifer Milton's Lucifer?
Well, that's interesting. Her Lucifer is Milton's Lucifer. Yes, absolutely. And I think what you see that she understands about Lucifer is that Lucifer gets all the good language. Lucifer is the one who can tempt and can gloze, right? Who's got all of this, who's up in your ear, And I think that with her in the work, that also connects to violation, that also connects to mistrust, having someone up in your ear in that particular way. And so what's kind of powerful is that she's imagining what would it mean to step into that power through the common material of the word. And use the word in that way. So I think, I'm saying this off the top of my head, but it's a great question. I'm thinking that she's less interested in evil when she explores Lucifer and more interested in power. And that's kind of interesting. And that also feels to me somehow Morrisonian, actually. So if you all agree, that means, that's a richer question in the way that those women understood these things richly. But I think also, and this gets back, we can keep adding on to Tracy's question, thinking about etymology in her poems. And that's what the turning over of the same word across 50 years shows us too. Her tremendous interest in etymology, in words that are sometimes actually pretty short and seemingly unyielding. So she doesn't go, the poems are not full of long Latinate words that you can be showy with your etymology. It's like stone soup language. It's impoverished language in a certain way that she turns into something, which is kind of an amazing feat. Yes?
I was wondering who she did the Ouija board with. Because, and maybe two senses of with, because you do that with someone else.
You have to?
I think so, right? You kind of need to cancel each other out, or you do it in a
No,
group.
you're.
Can you do it by yourself?
Authoritatively from the front row.
I'll show you.
Well, redirect.
So maybe where I get that idea is from the other.
From James Merrill.
We
Sure, yeah, right.
There's so much, between him and his lover, Jim Jackson.
Well, yes, and that's, I don't know a lot about that, except that, of course, famously, and so The Changing Light at Sandover and the other books where the Ouija board is in there would be really, really interesting to look and see. And also, I think a way of Merrill was pretty much Clifton's contemporary, and I bet they've never been spoken in a sentence together. So to me, also, the big project, mostly in my teaching with thinking about African American poetry, is will you please put Robert Lowell next to Gwendolyn Brooks and Elizabeth Bishop and stop talking about Lowell and Bishop over here. And in fact, you know what, Brooks is the genius, provocatively said. Those are great poets. But this way that, the great geniuses of the 20th century are contemporary with another great genius as though they had nothing to do with each other. Doesn't really, we have so much to understand once we look at those crossings about American literary history. So thank you, you've given me something thinking about. There's a little something right there to put those two together.
Actually,
Yes.
I enjoyed your talk very much. I wanted to also ask you about ancestry, because you mentioned that the overall title of the lectures is The Idea of Ancestry in African American Art. And when you mentioned that Lucille Clifton sometimes wrote intertextual poems, I thought perhaps that by ancestry we're talking more than about extended family, about memories of literal ancestors, but rather fitting into a tradition of practice, and that one's ancestors are also past practitioners of the art form, but clearly ancestor in a more literal sense is important for her as well.
Well, yeah, no, certainly, and I think that I would probably separate the two strands, and that, what I've mentioned about the whole intertextual aspect of her work would be the way to speak about how I don't think that she had a grandiose literary mission in the way that you see in poetry. I think, I'm sure I've done it. It's easy to do. You gesture towards an ancestor and look oh so smart. You gesture towards an ancestor and put yourself in a lineage. You gesture towards an ancestor and you're standing up there too. And even if that's not conscious, I think sometimes that is rewarded in American poetry, and so there is too much schooly poetry that only shows you went to school, really, and even, you could even narrow how you went to school and what you studied and how you were taught in that way. Look at first books, mine included, and epigraphs. And, the epigraphs, which really are an Ernest Young school poet's way of saying, I read this, I took it in, I refigured it, this is I live in books, it's a living thing for me too. But I think at the end of the day is something that is an amateur's gesture, because it, I think, keeps you from the thing itself, You
mentioned Bill T. Jones last year spoke, and in his book In Progress, he speaks about when he was a young dancer, he was sort of struggling to move from an anteroom of a culture into the mainstream, and he felt that he was not accepted fully, at least at the beginning of his career. And I wonder if Lucille Clifton at all went through a similar process of attempting to gain admission to a club, and without quite knowing what the sort of membership rituals were for entry into the main room. Was there ever anything analogous?
That's interesting. I haven't read her letters. She was not a woman in a hurry. Again, she was very entrenched in family. So she published her poems, but modestly. But right from the beginning, she was published very well. It was a funny moment in American publishing. I think that Lucille Clifton wouldn't have been with the presses that she was in the early 70s today. I think she would have had a quite different publishing path, actually, and that's sort of interesting. But, I think that she was in some ways so outside of one aspect of the club, right? But at the same time, the club that she was part of was, I would say, other black women writers, many of whom were mothers, many of whom were dealing with the practicalities of life. So there's a fantastic conversation between her and Sonia Sanchez, where, you know, again, like you can't be at the Algonquin room, you know, being witty when you're having kids and raising kids, you know, so it's not that kind of poetic society, but the preciousness of their conversation and their reflection is really, really rich and interesting. So what I find interesting is not that there is not ambition, but there is not ambition unto itself, that it's about just continuing to make those poems. Yeah, you're welcome.
I think get a question in there. I've been doing a lot of reading on about the free verse movement, about Emerson, about Whitman, about Sandburg, and their notions of simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
Hughes's notion of simplicity. They had the idea that, well, Hughes did. He said this, that poems should be simple and short. The shorter the better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So he was criticized for that, though, by some people saying that they were just too short.
Mm-hmm.
These were not really poems, right?
Mm-hmm.
People didn't understand that there was craft in simplicity.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So I wanted you to talk a bit more about that, because I'm dealing with that now, about this whole notion of simplicity as an artistic value,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
And so it's not just that I don't have time, I'm just going to make this
No, that's
quick.
right, that's right, that's right.
So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's great, and I'm so glad that you brought up Hughes, who's a fantastic analogy, and who, you know, she could not have avoided him as an influence, of course, and certainly would have embraced him as an influence. And also, when I think of poems as kind of objects that you could hold in your hand, and a Hughes poem weighs about the same amount as a Lucille Clifton poem. You know, they're like objects. And as you say, certainly, I think that particularly with regard to his engagement with jazz and the blues, you know, and how underestimated the brilliance of, you know, I defy anybody now to try to write a blues poem or a jazz poem, and to think that he was doing that in the 1920s when the dissemination of this was new music, newly disseminated, newly available music. In the letters with Carl Van Vechten and others, they're, you know, sending blues records back and forth and saying, did you hear this, did you hear that? It's all very new, and he spins something out of it in a way that's very extraordinary, and that belies the complexity. So I think I would get back to, I'm really interested in aphorisms and in the aphoristic aspects of culture, the aphoristic space of Black culture. And I don't know, I would need to learn a whole lot more to think about how to connect that to West African proverbialness, right? You know, and, you know, the kind of the pithy proverb that understands and encompasses so deeply, that often has a turn or a rhyme, that has a clear sense of form, and that imparts so much. I really feel like that's the line, though again, I need to know more to make that scholarly claim. And that certainly, you know, that's also the path through mother wit. And in her poems, her Thelma Sales poems, her mother, Thelma Sales, was a poet who burned all her work, who was told that she couldn't be a poet, shouldn't be a poet by her father. So I think that in a way also the ambition, if you will, to go back to your question, what motivates, she is rewriting the life her mother couldn't have in very explicit ways. So there are a lot of poems where her mother speaks through her. Sometimes matter-of-factly from the dead. Sometimes her mother actually writes her letters from the dead. And it's a whole nother voice, it's a whole different voice, though it is consistently Clifton's poetic voice. So I think, I think about it as a practitioner, it's hard to do that. It is easier to carry on. It really is. It is much harder. Oh, we know this with our papers, right?
Yeah.
I said a 5-page paper. I didn't say an 8-page paper. You know,
Right.
I'm gonna stop reading at page 5 because it's harder
Yeah. Well, one
to
of the
write a
things-
5-page paper.
One of the things I'm discovering is so interesting, is that so much content has to be encased or captured in so few words. And I think that's why Hughes was fascinated by the simple poem, because he had to say so much with so few words.
That's
One of
right.
his poems is one of his most beautiful poems. It's called Suicide Note.
Yes.
It's 8 words.
Yes.
It's lovely, positively lovely.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes.
So I
Or
think
poems that I think have a lot to do with Clifton, like I had a, how does that beautiful poem go? I had a friend, and my friend left,
Yeah.
and I don't have a friend anymore. Do you know that poem? It's a beautiful, beautiful distilled, or Nobody Loves a Genius Child.
Yeah.
Beautifully simple distilled poems. But I think again, sometimes we don't do well to measure poetry by the pound. But I think that sometimes, and we were talking about this the other day, thinking about Clifton as an epic poet. Kevin Young talks about the whole book as an epic. And it was a whole new lens. But also the trick of it is he's saying, well, what if you added it all up and thought about it with the same kind of value that we think about the Iliad or the Aeneid or other epics that purport to tell the story of the tribe over time? How would that change how we value it? So I think it's a really good exercise. Yeah. Yes?
I'd like to thank you for your talk. It really clarified a lot of her poetry for me, because I went to a lot of the readings from the Gerald Leonard Dodge Poetry Festival.
Oh, yes, yes.
And this past year, her daughters came to
Oh,
her performance.
wonderful.
I read all of her books, and I really appreciate the clarity that you gave to all of her poetry. And
Thank you.
I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, she was a fixture at the Dodge Festival, and it was always amazing to see her there. She also, as you probably know, became poet famous. That's another thing, poet famous. But because of the Bill Moyers shows, those wonderful shows that he did, and I'm happy that happened, because I think that what we have the privilege of doing now is thinking about some of the other ways that the work means and does, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the work has spoken profoundly, and in her person, she spoke profoundly to legions of folks. She gave poetry to many, many more people than most of us do, consistently.
You have also, I have one of the Cave Canem books with your emancipation poem.
Oh, that's wonderful. Those are valuable, those little Cave Canem books. That's wonderful. Yes. Great.
Well,
Okay.
thank you. Let's